Hey everybody, so this is my presentation on the Enneagram that I did in Super Saturday today, and I really enjoyed sharing it. I ended up changing the information to a more friendly PowerPoint view. If you were at Super Saturday, then you know what I mean. And so hopefully this is a little bit more straightforward, and I kind of reorganize things a little bit better. The Enneagram is just so deep and it's multifaceted and has so many different levels to it that I have so much passion for the Enneagram and what it can do for people individually and collectively. And so I felt very lost in the details because I just wanted to get everything out there. And after, going through it again and putting in this PowerPoint, I was able to better conceptualize what I wanted to bring forward. So I hope to give you a conceptual view of how the Enneagram works, and you can understand how it's structured, what its purpose is, what it can do for us, and hopefully be able to start your journey as well. So when we think about the Enneagram, we have to define it, obviously. And so what is the Enneagram? It is a personality typing system, and it describes human personality in 9 categories, and it looks at what each type is motivated by rather than their behavior. Behavior is more of a symptom of our core motivations and fears, and that's very important to keep in mind as you are going through this, just this presentation, but also if you choose to explore it further, because other personality inventories look at behavior, and the Enneagram focuses on what is our core fear, our core motivation that drives that behavior, because behavior can look similar on the outside, but what motivates it can be very different. So when we think about personality, it's, a collection of adaptive strategies we use to get along with people, but often this becomes a problem in adulthood. The Enneagram takes into account how fluid and adaptive humans are compared to other inventories, while also offering a path for growth. And that is the wisdom of the Enneagram. You're not just going to get knowledge dumped on you, you are going to get wisdom, and wisdom on how to move to health and be the best you. And it is just so powerful and life-changing. So within the Enneagram, there are 3 triads of emotion, 3 centers of intelligence, 9 types, 2 wings, 3 subtypes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's just kind of the gist of it. So in all of that, there are 27 possible personality types within the Enneagram. The Enneagram, it's a tool full of wisdom to help people get out of their own way and become who they were created to be, a tool to deepen your love for God and others. The true origin of the Enneagram is unknown, but it has been traced back to an ancient Christian monk and mystic. His name is Evagrius. And so that's what the most common accepted origin is, but it's not really for sure. Either way, it's very old. No one's really sure where it started, but it's ancient. Its current form has been traced back to the Christian monk, which I said, and this is where the idea of 7 deadly sins comes from. This 9-pointed geometric figure shows up in relation to personality in other areas of the world as well. In the early 20th century, a Russian philosopher used the Enneagram to teach on esoteric subjects not related to personality. In the 1970s, a teacher from Chile learned of it, and he made significant contributions by combining what he had learned about the Enneagram with studies of inner work he'd learned in South America and Asia. One of his students was an American-trained psychiatrist, and he brought those teachings to the United States and taught them to a group of Catholic priests and seminary students. And that was in the early 1900s when it first entered Western culture, and then developed further by this American psychiatrist in the 1970s. And then in kind of our time, it's been trending a little bit in the last decade or so, definitely in the last couple years as well. The Enneagram is a gift. It gives us so much. It gives us so much wisdom. There's so much gold in it that improves our lives. I wish I had so much time to explain all of the potential that it has, and that innate potential of just what it is, but also of the many ways to apply it. Um, and so, just to kind of talk about a few, it allows us to rewrite the stories we told ourselves what we need to do to survive. So, in childhood, how we viewed the world and took it in, and what we told ourselves was the way we had to operate to survive. We're able to rewrite those stories because often the way we view that isn't always healthy. Um, we are the only things that keep us from being our true self. Relationships can't grow without individual work, and the Enneagram gives us this amazing, rich opportunity to be able to work on ourselves individually so we can optimize our relationships, friendships, whatever that dynamic is. It allows us to celebrate and bless our differences. We're able to get the log out of our own eye without looking at the other person and trying to help them get the log out of their eye, which is so powerful. We're able to transcend our default modes and keep our ego from running the show. A lot of theologians and therapists that are into the Enneagram, psychiatrists, psychologists, all of it, they believe that the Enneagram is the tool to help us find true abundant life. It also allows us to access true compassion. Compassion without that deep self-knowledge is sometimes confused as pity. And so sometimes we pity and we think it's compassion, and the Enneagram allows us to understand what true compassion is. Also, the more that we accept our incompleteness, which the Enneagram does a great job at exposing our incompleteness, we become free to be more complete. And that's how a lot of the parts of the Enneagram works. It's this double jeopardy, two-edged sword kind of thing, that our greatest strength is our greatest self-weapon. And the more that we can accept our incompleteness, we become free to be more complete. The Enneagram is the beginning of love, because with this self-knowledge and growth, we're able to love ourselves truly in our brokenness, in our incompleteness. But when we're able to love ourselves for who we are, we're able to love others, truly love them, and bless their differences and honor them as for who they are. But also we're able to have a deepened love with God. And something that I heard said once on the Enneagram was, so far the blind only know what they touch. And that kind of demonstrates how deep the Enneagram is and your journey to self-knowledge. And by us being able to explore ourselves in this path that the Enneagram gives us, we're blind. We go through life blind of so many parts about ourselves, and we only know what we don't know until we touch it. And getting in tune with the Enneagram and what it has to offer just is so revealing. The Enneagram is wisdom for people who want to get out of their own way. It's kind of like, have you ever noticed that you're the one character that appears in every scene in this soap opera you call life? You are in the way of becoming your best self. Many of us, without knowing it, have given up on ourselves. We resign to the fact that things aren't going to be different. But the Enneagram revives our hope and change, and we're able to do that in this self-exploration. One thing I love about the Enneagram is how it shows how each number relates to different things, whether that's an emotion, whether that's an action, behavior, etc. And pain is one of those things. And we have primary and secondary pain, kind of like grief, concrete versus ambiguous grief. But in pain, we have this primary pain, and that can refer to like the event that initiated the pain. And then the secondary pain is, how do we interpret and manage and deal with that pain? What do we do to make that pain mean? And that can be good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, whatever it is. But pain that it's not transformed becomes transmitted. And you will see that as we kind of explore the Enneagram and all the different types of how, when you can't transform your pain, emotions, your grief, and anything else into the best part of you, you transmit it. It goes into the concept that each number has an ego, and that's a whole different part of the Enneagram that we're not going to talk about today, but it's, this each number has this higher and lower level of behavior, and the lower level behavior begets lower level behavior in the other. So our wounded egos want to hurt the other's wounded ego. We automatically assume that we have a right to behave this way, but the Enneagram helps broaden this view and foster understanding so that we can understand when our egos are fighting against another person or ourselves, and how to do something about it. And lastly, the Enneagram helps us understand what evil we're capable of. As we go into this, we'll talk a lot about the lower level functioning of numbers and how numbers can manifest in unhealthy ways, or sometimes referred to as disintegration. But when we can understand what we're capable of in terms of that unhealthy part of who we are, we're able to prevent it and do something about it, whereas sometimes we operate in that manner without even knowing it. And the Enneagram allows us to accept ourselves and accept that we've been accepted even though we're innately unacceptable. And that kind of goes into more of a spiritual aspect as well. So there's a couple of things to just preface the Enneagram with. It takes a lot of courage to go on an Enneagram journey because it unmasks us. It's like somebody reading your daily mail in a way of your personality. It exposes our brokenness in a way that, we've been hiding and avoiding and using those adaptive parts of our personality to conceal, and it exposes it. And a lot of times people who go on their Enneagram journey feel this unmasked, vulnerable, kind of cringy state of how did they get in my head and write that out, and how are other people in the world operating like that? So it's very revealing, and it can really hurt our ego at first, because nobody wants to hear what they are doing in their unhealthy parts. And so it's very powerful. And sometimes even in that exploration, we avoid, and we will read something, and maybe it's a number we're feeling like might be our number, or whatever the case is, and we'll immediately react of, oh, well, I don't struggle with pride, or I don't struggle with XYZ. And paying attention to our reactions is vital, because it does hurt to read your brokenness in a way that is painful, but it's also revealing, because it doesn't just leave you there in that brokenness. It gives you a path to grow from it. With the numbers, there's no value significance. They're just numbers. In other words, a higher number doesn't equate to a lower value, or higher value, I mean. They just are what they are. There is no right or wrong compatibility type, whether that's in marriage, friendship, workplace, etc. Each number is capable of integrating with another when they are both in health. So I'm going to give an overview of the structure of the Enneagram because it is so multifaceted. You'll see the image on the right of this slide of the Enneagram itself, and how, each number has this place on this circle, and there's lines coming to and away from it, and we'll dive into that more later, but that is the Enneagram in itself. There are 9 types that are grouped into 2 different triads. So we have a triad of our primary emotion, which is anger, shame, and fear. And then we have another triad, which is the dominant center of our intelligence, or sometimes referred to as our stance. And this center of intelligence is thinking, feeling, and doing. So think of cognitive triad. And each of these stances orient differently to time. Then when you look at each number, each of the 9 numbers has an internal structure containing different levels of development. And this level, is on a continuum. It goes from healthy to average to unhealthy, or sometimes referred to as integration to disintegration, etc. But it's on a continuum. So for example, if you're a 9, you can be in your unhealthy part or average part or healthy part. And a good way to look at the Enneagram is we get to understand the window in which we interpret and view the world, but also we're able to peer into other people's windows as well, which is so powerful. If you think of the game Twister, where it's really fun when you're a kid, but it's very difficult to make your way with people if you can't reach for where they're standing and you can't leave where you're standing. We have to have more fluidity and incorporating all 3 stances so that thinking, feeling, and doing together. And maturity is sometimes referred to as being able to hold all 3 of those stances, thinking, feeling, and doing, and your consciousness, awareness, and experiences. And if you think about it, I mean, how many therapy modalities reflect that theme? Another thing that is important to kind of keep in mind about the Enneagram is that it shows us that where our head is, your head isn't. So I should say that as where my head is, your head isn't, and that's okay. We're able to appreciate where our head is, how we view the world and what we do with it, and also be okay that that other person's head isn't there as well. So this is a very rough view of the structure of the Enneagram. So starting from the top, just the Enneagram, and then we have those 2 triads that I mentioned. So the primary emotion triad and then the center of intelligence triad, or our stance. And each number falls into both of those triads, but not the same triad always. So for example, a number could be in a different center of intelligence triad than primary emotion triad, whereas they do have some overlap. So then below those 2 triads, you have the 9 types. Each type, as shown under 5, each type has this, but I only did it under 5, was each type has a wing, and then they have a subtype. And there are 3 types of subtypes: sexual or one-on-one, social, and self-preserving. So as an overview of these triads, we have the primary emotion and the center of intelligence, or our stance. So first, going into primary emotion, that's on the left of this slide. Each triad is driven in different ways by an emotion related to a part of the body known as the center of intelligence. It's how we take in, process, and respond to life. So each number is going to relate to this emotion in their core fears, core desire, key motivations, etc. And the same for the stance, is they're going to refer to that stance, and that stance is going to impact their core fears, desires, motivations as well. So for the primary emotion triads, we have the anger or gut triad, and that is 8, 9s, and 1s. We have the feeling or heart triad, and that's 2, 3s, and 4s, and the fear or head triad, which is 5, 6, and 7s. Going into stances on the right side of this slide, our stance help us get what we want or achieve a goal, kind of going back to our core fears and desires and motivations. It's how we interpret information from our world. And so within there's 3 stances: assertive or aggressive stance, dependent stance, and withdrawing stance. Each number has all 3 of those, but one is dominant and one is repressed. And then the last one is their supported one. So for example, in the aggressive stance, we have 3, 7s, and 8s. So they are doing dominant, feeling repressed. So that means that they are thinking supported. So they take in information from the world around them by what it makes them do, what they need to do about it. Their thinking supports that doing, and their feeling is repressed. And then so on and so on. So the dependent stance, we have 1, 2s, and 6s. And then with the drawing stance, we have 4, 5s, and 9s. So an overview of the 9 types, there's that graphic you can see there that kind of tells you what they're often called by and what they like to do. Like for example, we have the 9 at the top. They're sometimes called the peacemaker or mediator. They like keeping the peace. 8, the protector. They like being in control and protecting others, and so on and so on. Each number has these key components, which I've kind of mentioned already, but this basic fear, basic desire, key motivation, they're part of an emotional triad, they're part of a stance, they have 2 different line movements, and then 9 levels of development within each number, which we'll go into more, but that's just an overview. So when you're thinking about these core things, like this core fear, desire, motivation, that is what drives all the behavior, everything they do, how they repress, how they're dominant, and so on. And so that's why it's so important that when you're exploring your type is that you're looking inward and you're spending time self-reflecting and increasing your self-awareness so that you can understand what motivates you instead of just looking at your behavior, because behavior can look the same for different motivations. So a brief overview of wings and subtypes, which I'm not going to spend time explaining that because it's a little bit more in depth and it requires more of a foundation before getting into that, but it's important to know what it is and how it works. So for wings, on the left side of this slide, there's an illustration that shows, it points out 9 and then it points to the 2 numbers next to it. So for a 9, there's 2 wings, 1 and 8. That's your only option in terms of wings. So it's the numbers right next to you on the Enneagram. The wings are the part of your personality that you most resonate with next to you. There are 2 different schools of thought when it comes to wings. The most commonly accepted one is that we only pull from one wing and it's our dominant. So you're a 9 with a wing 1, not 9 with a wing 1 and an 8. And so a 9 with a wing 1 is very different than a 9 with a wing 8, and so on and so on. There are some people who believe that you pull from both numbers depending on the situation and life event or whatever the case is going on, but it's just 2 different schools of thought. Personally, I only see myself in one of my wings. I don't see it in the other one, so I can't resonate with that second school of thought, but that's how it works. And so with that wing, it's how that personality next to you supports your core personality. So it comes alongside of it and it's more of who you are. So with subtypes, there are 3 subtypes, and each number has these 3 subtypes, but one is usually dominant. And so they're instinctual. It's what we did to survive in childhood, and we carry that on into adulthood. So we have self-preservation, one-to-one, and social. And one-to-one is often referred to as sexual as well. And when we say social, sexual, and self-preservation, it doesn't mean exactly what those words literally mean. In other words, if you're thinking social subtype probably means you're more outgoing or social, that's not what it's referring to. It's referring to something a little bit deeper than that. And same with self-preservation and one-to-one instinct. But that's just kind of an overview. You can read some of the descriptions there for you, but I'm gonna not spend a lot of time on that. But just so you have an idea of that's what it is. So as I mentioned earlier, each number has 2 different lines coming from it, and it makes this geometrical diagram, and it shows how each of the numbers integrate with each other, help each other, relate to each other, etc. And so each number goes to another number in stress and another number in growth. And we can't live without these numbers. We need our stress number to manage stress. We need our growth number to help us step outside of ourselves. The goal is that we are able to go to our growth and stress numbers at their higher levels of development. In other words, as if an 8 is going to 2 in growth, they want to go to the higher level of 2, the healthy part of 2, in order to grow. And so when we're thinking of this, we're thinking again of the motivations and concepts behind that number and not the behavior. So for example, 2s are very helpful. They know how to take care of people's needs, and they They're always looking at the temperature of the room and temperature of people around them, whereas 8s tend to be more inward. And so for growth, it doesn't necessarily mean that, they need to host a party at their house and be the hostess for everybody. But the concept behind it is that they can, in growth, look outward and acknowledge other people's needs outside of themselves. And then so on and so on. So again, stressing the importance of looking at what motivates each number in their health and unhealth, etc. So, an overview of levels of development. As mentioned, each number has 9 levels of development, and that is that continuum from healthy to unhealthy to integration to disintegration and so on. And so on the right of this slide, you'll see the template for that in all the different levels, 3 different categories, 9 different levels within that. And so, for example, if we were talking about a 9 here, a 9 can be in any of the levels within their healthy space, same as average and unhealthy space. In terms of the continuum, we move up and down it. Sometimes people don't even know what the average and healthy space of their number is. That's also why it's good when you're exploring your number to spend a lot of time in that unhealthy space in terms of researching it. So that way you might resonate more with that unhealthy part because we're humans and we spend more time there often. I inserted the graphic on the left of the slide to represent the continuum because sometimes that's what it looks like. It's not quite this up and down, gradual movement. Sometimes it's dramatic. Sometimes it's seamless. Sometimes it's, productive, and sometimes it's a mess. And so I thought that was a good way to illustrate it. But each number has this interval structure, and it's a continuum of behaviors, attitudes, defenses, and motivations that define that personality type. And so this is an extremely important part to look at when you're exploring your number, as well as just understanding how you operate in stress and emotions and all of the things. It's also important to note that if you realize that you're in an unhealthy part or maybe in a space where you want to move up into a healthier level, you can't just choose to change your health. You can't just be like, okay, well, I'm going to be in level 1 all the time now. You have to seek self-awareness and observe yourself well enough, and that's what creates the change. Next, I'm going to give a brief overview of the types and their stance. So, as a review, the stance is the center of intelligence, thinking, feeling, doing. Each number is part of a triad that center of intelligence is dominant and repressed. Even the numbers that are part of the same triad in terms of what they're dominant and repressed in, they still manage that in different ways. Okay, so first up is the dependent stance. This is 1, 2s, and 6s. They are feeling dominant, thinking repressed, and oriented to the present. So each of these stance triads have an orientation to time, and that's past, present, or future. Orientation to time is comforted by our stance. And so again, going back to how our core needs, desires, fears, motivations are met, our stance supports that position. So when we say feeling dominant and thinking repressed, it means that these numbers take in their world around them with how it makes them feel, and they are thinking repressed. When we say repressed, it doesn't mean that they don't think. Same with doing repressed and feeling repressed. It doesn't mean that they're not doing, thinking, or feeling. It means that what they are doing in that repressed state is not productive. So in this dependent stance, they make sense of the world by those around them. They know how to take the temperature of the room and the people they're around. These numbers in the dependent stance, they believe they think all of the time, and they do, but again, what they're thinking about isn't productive. So for ones, they have this inner dialogue with their inner critic, and they interpret that as thinking, but the conversation is usually a defensive one. They have to provide answers to this very demanding inner critic within themselves. And they perceive that as thinking. But really, it's this conversation that's not productive. With twos, they spend their time thinking about relationships and connection. They think about the last encounter with every person they come across, whether it's a stranger or somebody they bumped to in the hallway at work, whatever the case is. They're thinking about, did I do something to make them mad at me? Did I say something wrong? How is our connection hurt by something I did? Sixes, they spend their time thinking about the worst thing that may happen, and then they plan for it. So they spend their time thinking and planning for the worst case scenario, but most of what they're planning for never happens. So this thinking is not productive. When we talk about their orientation to time, they're orientated to the present, and that supports their stance. And what I mean by that is that if they're orientated to the present, in other words, what they're focused on, what we focus on, what we're oriented with it determines what we miss. And so with them being oriented to the present, they don't have to carry the burden of what's already happened in the past, and they don't have to plan for where they're going in the future. Again, it doesn't mean that they don't do those things. It's that they are hyper focused on the present. They spend their time in the present because thinking about the past or feeling things about the past, whatever the case is too much. And so they like to avoid that. Same with the future, and they orient to the present. So the withdrawn stance. This is 4, 5s, and 9s. They are thinking dominant and doing repressed and oriented to the past. So they take in information from their world by what they think about it. Then they are doing repressed. So, for example, in this case, their feelings would be supportive to what they think. So 4s, because of how they see the world, they're comfortable with longing. They're attached to longing. They're okay with that wishful, just waiting for something to happen. That they confuse their doing by focusing on what doesn't exist. In other words, they spend time doing what they think is doing by focusing on what they're longing for, what they're wishing for. And a quote sometimes used for 4s is they can fall in love with a ghost. They struggle the most with the mundane, and so this prevents them from doing productive things, which is defined as doing repressed. With 5s, they are doing repressed because they confuse planning as doing. And they end up not getting a lot of things done due to all the planning and gathering of resources they have to do before they take action. And all of these stances will make more sense when you understand the numbers, but it's important to understand just conceptually how they operate. With 5s, it's, for example, if a 5 wanted to write a book, well, then they need to get a new pen to write with, and then they got to get a special book to do it with, and then now they want a new desk to do it with, and then they realize they want their desk in front of a window, so they got to rearrange rooms, and it just goes on and on and on to where they're planning and gathering so many resources that they end up not getting around to a lot of the things that they need to do. With 9s, they are always doing, but not what needs to be done. They struggle with prioritizing. What's interesting about 9s is that often, again, not every single 9 out there, but often is if you give them a list of 10 things and it's, tasks that they need to complete, they just see each one equal. They don't know how to prioritize, and this usually is overwhelming and prevents them from getting what needs to be done. So their orientation is to the past, and the way this supports their stance is they get away doing repressed because they forget what they missed out on because they were doing repressed. They weren't really doing much, and so they don't really know what they're missing out of. And so that supports this withdrawn stance of doing repressed. So the last stance we have are 3s, 7s, and 8s, and they're in the aggressive stance, sometimes called the assertive stance. But they are doing dominant and feeling repressed, and so they take in their world around them, the information around them, by what they need to do about it, and they are feeling repressed. And again, it doesn't mean they don't feel, it just means that what they do feel, or what they try to feel, manipulate their feelings to be, isn't productive. And so threes take in information with feelings, which is interesting for an aggressive stance, but they don't use it to make decisions or process things. They box up their feelings because they're achievers and they just don't have time for it. It stops them from getting their goals met. They can read people in situations and know what the other person needs, but they flip off their feelings and just get to it to get things done. As they're kids and they're growing up, they learn to set aside their feelings quicker, because the quicker the better, because more things get done and they're achievers. Sevens are feeling repressed because they have a limited range of feelings. It's hard for them to feel all feelings, and it's like half range of emotions, and they have to be very mindful of how to access that other half range of emotions that they're missing out of. And so what sevens do is they reframe everything into positive. One of their core motivations is to escape pain. And so they're also these enthusiasts, and they love just, going and doing and having fun. But sometimes that's motivated by their desire to escape pain. And so when they feel things that are uncomfortable, painful, they have this way of reframing it all into positive. And sometimes it misleads them to thinking that they're truly positive about things. All of these numbers in this aggressive stance are very intense. They have a lot of energy. They're very objective in terms of all the numbers, but eights have the most. They have the most energy out of all the 9 types. They love passion. They're passionate about things. They love intensity. And what they do as feeling repressed is that they confuse that feeling of passion and intensity with feeling. And so this helps them avoid feelings they don't want to feel, because their main motivation is to avoid feeling weak and avoid vulnerability, because they have this strength that is a gift. But as with every number, our gifts are our own weapons. And so they know how to think and perceive that they're feeling, when really they just love that intensity. Eights also have this ability to express feeling without the emotion, and they've learned a way to detach themselves from that emotion. So in this aggressive stance, 3s, 7s, and 8s, they're orientated to the future. So they're thinking about what they need to do for whatever's coming ahead. They don't worry about the past, the present. I mean, they're just more focused on the future and what they want to do, because they're all very passionate numbers. They have goals, they're driven, they're doing dominant, so they're doing a lot of things that are productive, and they're looking ahead on the future. And this supports their stance because they move at this fast pace. It gives them an excuse for not having feelings of, well, we got to get this done. We got to get to the next thing. We have this, and we have all these things ahead of us that we're looking forward to. And we love the feeling of anticipation and passion and intensity, that it supports our feeling repressed by giving us an excuse for not having a relationship with our feelings. This next part is going to go over the triad of dominant emotions. Similar to stances, each number, has this dominant emotion that correlates to their core fear, desire, motivation, and each number does something different with that primary emotion. Here is just a kind of like a graph of an easy way to look at the triad's expressions. You can look at that if you want to better understand how, okay, in this heart triad, this is what this looks like. Maybe this is an emotion or a reaction, etc. Again, this isn't the end all be all. It's just a concept that if you don't resonate with how the behavior manifests, you have to look even deeper within yourself to understand how that behavior does manifest. So the heart triad, their primary emotion is shame, and this is 2, 3s, and 4s. 2s externalize shame, 3 have this unconscious avoidance, and 4s internalize shame. The heart triad is motivated by feelings. 2s attempt to control their shame by getting other people to like them and to think of them as good people. They also want to convince themselves that they are good, loving people by focusing on their positive feelings for others while repressing their negative feelings, such as anger and resentment, at not being appreciated enough. As long as 2s can get positive emotional responses from others, they feel wanted and are able to control feelings of shame. 3s try to deny shame and are potentially the most out of touch with underlying feelings of inadequacy. 3s learn to cope with shame by trying to become what they believe a valuable, successful person is like. Thus, 3s learn to perform well, to be acceptable, even outstanding, and are often driven relentlessly in their pursuit of success as a way of starving off feelings of shame and fears of failure. 4s attempt to control their shame by focusing on how unique and special their particular talents, feelings, and personal characteristics are. 4s highlight their individuality and creativity as a way of dealing with their shameful feelings. Although 4s are the type most likely to have feelings of inadequacy. 4s also manage their shame by cultivating a rich romantic fantasy in life, so kind of going back to that in love with a ghost idea. That in which they don't have to deal with whatever in their life seems drab or uninteresting to them. Next, we have the head triad. Their primary emotion is fear. This is 5, 6, and 7s. 5s externalize fear, 6 internalize fear, and 7s have this unconscious avoidance. So the head triad, they're motivated by fear. 5s have fear about the outer world and about their capacity to cope with it. Thus, they cope with their fear by withdrawing from the world. 5s become secretive, isolated loners who use their minds to penetrate into the nature of the world. 5s hope that eventually, as they understand reality on their own terms, they'll be able to rejoin the world and participate in it, but they never feel they know enough to participate with total confidence. Instead, they involve themselves with increasingly complex inner worlds. 6s exhibit the most fear of all 3 types in this triad, largely experienced as anxiety, which causes them to be the most out of touch with their sense of inner knowing and confidence. Unlike 5s, 6s have trouble trusting their own minds, so they are constantly looking outside themselves for something to make them feel sure of themselves. They might turn to philosophies, beliefs, relationships, jobs, savings, authorities, or any combination of the above. But no matter how many security structures they create, 6s still feel doubtful and anxious. They may even begin to doubt the very people and beliefs that they have turned to for reassurance. 6s may also respond to their fear and anxiety by impulsively confronting it, defying their fear in the effort to be free of it. 7s have a fear about their inner world. There are feelings of pain, loss, deprivation, and general anxiety that 7s would like to stay clear of as much as possible. To cope with those feelings, 7s keep their minds occupied with exciting possibilities and options. As long as they have something stimulating to anticipate, 7s feel they can distract themselves from their fears. 7s, in most cases, do not stop merely at thinking about these options, however. As much as possible, they attempt to actually do as many of their options as they can. Thus, 7s can be found staying on the go, pursuing one experience after another, and keeping themselves entertained and engaged with their many ideas and activities. Lastly, we have the gut triad. Their primary emotion is anger, and this is 8, 9s, and 1s. 8s externalize anger. 9s have an unconscious avoidance, and 1s internalize anger. 8s act out their anger and instinctual energies. In other words, when they feel anger building in them, they immediately respond to it in an external way. Sometimes this can even be physical or raising their voices and even forcefully, but not always. That's not always how it's demonstrated, just like we've said so many times for all the numbers. The idea and concept behind it is that it's externalized. 9s deny their anger and instinctual energies as if to say, what anger? I am not a person who gets angry. 9s are the type most out of touch with their anger and instinctual energies, often feeling threatened by them. Of course, nines get angry like everyone else, but try to stay out of their darker feelings by focusing on idealizations of their relationships and their world. Lastly, ones attempt to control or repress their anger and instinctual energy. They feel that they must stay in control themselves, especially of their instinctual impulses and angry feelings at all times. They would like to direct these energies according to the dictates of their highly developed inner critic, their superego, the source of their strictures on themselves and others. Next, I'm going to go into the actual 9 types, a brief overview of their key components. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about each type because I realize that takes more time than I thought it would take from this morning. And also, a huge part of the Enneagram journey is getting a solid foundation and understanding of each type. So I'm just going to give you the overview, and if you'd like to learn more, then that's one of the most fun parts of the Enneagram, is just exploring the different types.
Also, I do want to add, I forgot to say earlier that when you're looking at your number, everybody only has one number that they're born with. Our numbers don't change. They're not changed by trauma or a life event. We're born with a number, and that's what it is. And finding our number is understanding what our number is despite trauma, despite whatever that event is that you're wondering, did that change my number because I see myself in this type or that type, etc. But I just wanted to emphasize that we're born with one number, and it is what it is.
So first up, we have type 1, and they're sometimes called the reformer. They're the rational idealistic type. Their basic fear is of being corrupt and evil, defective. Their basic desire is to be good, to have integrity, and to be balanced. Their key motivations is they want to be right, to strive higher and improve everything, to be consistent with their ideals, to justify themselves, to be beyond criticism, as to not be condemned by anyone. Their stance is they're in the dependent stance, so they are feeling dominant, thinking repressed, oriented to the present. In terms of the way they move on the Enneagram, they go to 7 in growth and 4 in stress. Type 2 is the helper. They are carrying the interpersonal type. Their basic fear is of being unwanted, unworthy of being loved. Their basic desire is to feel loved. Their key motivations is they want to be loved, to express their feelings for others, to be needed and appreciated, to get others to respond to them, to vindicate their claims about themselves. They're also in the dependent stance, so they're feeling dominant, thinking repressed, and orientated to the present. They go to 4 in growth and 8 in stress. Type 3 is referred to as the achiever. They're success-oriented, pragmatic type. Their basic fear is of being worthless. Their basic desire is to feel valuable and worthwhile. And their key motivations is they want to be affirmed, to distinguish themselves from others, to have attention, to be admired, and to oppress others. Their stance, they are in the aggressive stance, so they are doing dominant, feeling repressed, and oriented to the future. 3s go to 9 in stress and 6 in growth. Type 4 is the individualist. They are the sensitive, introspective type. Their basic fear is that they have no identity or personal significance. Their basic desire is to find themselves and their significance, to create an identity. They often think that there is something infallibly wrong with them. Their key motivations is they want to express themselves and their individuality, to create and surround themselves with beauty, to maintain certain moods and feelings, to withdraw to protect their self-image, to take care of emotional needs before attending to anything else, to attract a rescuer. Their stance, they're in the withdrawn stance, so they are thinking dominant, doing repressed, and oriented to the past. They go to 1 in growth and 2 in stress. Type 5, they're the investigator. They are the intense cerebral type. Their basic fear is being useless, helpless, or incapable. Their basic desire is to be capable and competent. Their key motivations, they want to possess knowledge, to understand the environment, to have everything figured out as a way of defending the self from threats from the environment. They are in the withdrawn stance, so they are thinking dominant, doing repressed, and oriented to the past. They go to 8 in growth and 7 in stress. Type 6, they are the loyalist. They are the committed, security-oriented type. Their basic fear is of being without support and guidance. Their basic desire is to have security and support. Their key motivations is they want to have security, to feel supported by others, to have certitude and reassurance, to test the attitudes of others toward them, to fight against anxiety and insecurity. They are in the dependent stance, so they are feeling dominant, thinking repressed, oriented to the present. They go to 3 in stress and 9 in growth. Type 7 is the enthusiast. They are the busy, variety-seeking type. Their basic fear is of being deprived and in pain. Their basic desire is to be satisfied and content, to have their needs fulfilled. Their key motivations is they want to maintain their freedom and happiness, to avoid missing out on worthwhile experiences, to keep themselves excited and occupied, to avoid and discharge pain. They are in the aggressive stance, so they are doing dominant, feeling repressed, and oriented to the future. 7s go to 5 in growth, and they go to 1 in stress. Type 8 is known as the challenger. They are the powerful, dominating type. Their basic fear is of being harmed or controlled by others. Their basic desire is to protect themselves, to be in control of their own life and destiny. Their key motivations is they want to be self-reliant, to prove their strength and resist weakness, to be important in their world, to dominate the environment, and to stay in control of their situation. They're in the aggressive stance. They are doing dominant, feeling repressed, and oriented to the future. 8s go to 2 in growth and 5 in stress.
So I am actually a type 8. And when I was going on my Enneagram journey, which was about a year ago or a little over a year ago, and I was trying to figure out my number, it was hard to figure it out because, as you probably are seeing yourself already, you find pieces of yourself in each number, and that's good. You want to see yourself in each number, but trying to understand your key motivations and your key fears and these core things about you is sometimes not always so evident. And being able to understand that what motivates what I do is being a protector of myself, but also other people, it has been very insightful and life-changing for me because I was able to understand how I use that strength to optimize my world and also how it can hurt me in a way. Like I've said so many times now, how our biggest strengths are our biggest self-weapons. And being an 8 is a gift. I enjoy being an 8. I love that I have this energy and strength to do things, no matter what it feels like. But on the other side of it, it's no matter what it feels like, we're feeling repressed. And it's not that I don't feel, it's that what I feel is not productive. I have a way of being able to express feelings without really feeling them. It feels that I don't have time for it. It sets me back. It doesn't allow me to do what I want to do. It takes up too much time, or sometimes feelings are vulnerable, and 8s and the aggressive stance in general, but especially 8s they struggle really hard with vulnerability. And if you'd asked me before Enneagram if I was vulnerable, I would have said, of course, I am a vulnerable person. I know how to express feelings and tell you what I'm feeling. I'm very self-aware, etc. And through the Enneagram, I learned that I was confusing transparency as vulnerability. And what I saw was that I was able to communicate what I felt completely detached from being vulnerable. I didn't have to feel it to communicate it. And so that's been a huge just gift for me, and that I can see in that brokenness of how it can be unhealthy and how it can hold me back from actually the strengths that come with being an 8 and practice vulnerability. And ever since I started the Enneagram, that has kind of been my goal for myself, is practicing vulnerability and reminding myself that having this strength is a gift, and you are strong enough to let people in. And that's sometimes extremely hard to trust. But when you can surround yourself with people you trust and you can say, you know what,
I need to practice vulnerability. And 8s are also very blunt and upfront. And I have a few people in my life where I've been able to just say that to them of, I have to practice vulnerability here. And I'm just going to tell you what I feel and do something with that, because I am feeling very insecure, because it makes me feel like I'm putting my strength aside, when in reality, it takes a lot of strength to do that. Lastly, we have type 9. They are the peacemaker. They're the easygoing type that gets along with everyone. Their basic fear is of loss and separation. Their basic desire is to have inner stability, peace of mind. Their key motivations is they want to create harmony in their environment, to avoid conflicts and tension, to preserve things as they are, to resist whatever would upset or disturb them. They are in the withdrawn stance, thinking dominant, doing repressed, and oriented to the past. So Will is 9, and he gave me permission to kind of share some of his thoughts that he and I talked about when we were discussing the Enneagram. And so as a 9, he describes it as 9s are peacemakers, keepers, oftentimes at the expense of themselves. A lot of times their peace is dependent on the peace of others, which can be a lot to carry, and learning boundaries is key. In terms of biggest strength of being a 9, Will said that I'd say the biggest strength is that I'm willing to see all sides of a discussion and give validation to both sides, even if there is one I don't agree with. Some of the challenges he described was making other people's issues my own and stepping into their chaos is difficult for me. I always have to remind myself that I can hear a person and empathize with their chaos, but I can't step into it. However, they are more than welcome to step into my peace, but it's a choice on their end to do that, something I'm not responsible for. And I also asked him what was the most revealing thing the Enneagram taught him, and this was what he said. He said, the most revealing thing was that it shows me my weakness in a way that it does not validate bad behavior. It shows me how to improve the areas of weakness and not use the revelation of those weak spots as a crutch. It also emphasizes the importance of being around people who will push me to improve myself. So this next part, I just kind of want to briefly touch on how the Enneagram is so helpful in relationships, and how we can understand each other better, whether it's in marriage or long-term relationships, friendships, workplace, any type of dynamic. So the Enneagram helps us in relationships because it allows us to manage conflict way more productively. Sometimes we think of conflict as bad, but conflict is what it is, and it exists, and there's nothing we can do about that. We just have to treat it like taking out the trash every day in a way, and we can use that conflict to bridge intimacy in the Enneagram. It allows us to accept both views and find a way to connect despite it being conflict. It allows us to have just a deeper, more wholeness and intimate relationship with that person. Again, whether it's a intimate relationship in marriage or, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, but also friendships. It also helps us learn to not take things personally. A good example for this is, if a 2 and a 1 are married and one comes home from work and maybe they're really stressed and the 2 had already done the dishes and the 1 comes in and they redo all the dishes. And what's motivating that behavior is that the 1s feel like there's a better way to do things and they're going to just do the right thing because it's better and they need to make sure everything is their brand of perfection. Well, that 2 can take that personally by interpreting that scenario as, maybe if I had done it better, they wouldn't be upset. I wouldn't have stressed them out. This is impacting our relationship. I'm not good enough. If I could just do the dishes right, they wouldn't have to redo it. But with the Enneagram, that situation can look so different. We're able to peer into each other's world and ask ourselves, what are they battling in their world? And how can I support them? And suddenly we stop taking things personally and we're able to look inside what they're feeling and thinking and doing and bless those differences. we're able to understand what battle they're fighting without making their battle about ourselves. We can leave our vantage point to see what they're experiencing. Sometimes we have this wishing for that person to be different, and that's kind of what gets us stuck in these ego fights. This lower level behavior begets lower level behavior, and my ego wants to hurt your ego, and so we're going to rehash dumb arguments day after day because we just can't get past it. And the Enneagram is a bridge for that, because again, we're able to leave our vantage point and look into that other person's world of what are you battling with, and what motivates you, and what brings you joy, and how can we bless each other's differences and also appreciate them. In a lot of ways, we assume that we all view the world the same way. Cognitively, none of us would admit that, because we can say, no, we all have different worldviews, and we're different, and we do things differently, and we might accept that at an intellectual level, but in relationships, we really don't, because that's where so much conflict comes from. And so a huge part in relationships is we have to grieve that we didn't marry ourselves, or we're not dating ourselves, or we're not friends with ourselves. And what I mean by that is that we really do have to grieve that, okay, I intellectually accept that we view the world differently, but I have to actually truly deeply grieve that your battle is not my battle, and what brings you joy is not what brings me joy, especially when they're in different stances. So a withdrawn stance and a doing dominant, the aggressive stance, when they're together, it can be very different, and they have to grieve what the other person needs in a way, and how it's different than ourselves. And so somebody who's on the go, and like a 7 who may want to recharge or heal from something, or process things with going on an adventure, going on a drive, or going four-wheeling in the mountains, whatever the case is. Let's say they're with a 5, and that 5 just needs a hotel room by themselves and no one else. And when they can acknowledge that about each other, and every number and every, combination, again, whether it's intimate relationship or friendship or workplace, we're able to authentically bless those differences. We're able to truly understand how that person was enriched by their experiences. So the Enneagram has a relationship with everything. Like I said earlier, there's so many levels, and it's multifaceted. And I mean, you can study the Enneagram in addiction, and Enneagram in marriage and workplace, and I mean, literally anything. There's a whole nother level to it. But I chose grief because I think that, with each number and its relationship to feelings, grief is so important. As we know, grief is a wave. There's not a method. There's not a right or wrong way to grieve, unless you're just not grieving. It's fluid. It comes in waves. It's unexpected. There's no really just concrete way to predict grief. And when it happens, people in society and our environments rush us to be better. They show up in the moment, but often quickly forget that we're grieving. And, kind of like primary and secondary pain, we have concrete grief and ambiguous grief. We have concrete grief in the sense of loss of a loved one, and then we have this ambiguous grief of, a couple who is longing to have children, or an individual longing to be married. They're in a way that's an ambiguous grief for them. And with grief, each number has a different relationship to it. And so I just want to kind of go over like tips for yourself and tips for people, if you have that number in your life, on how to best support them in their grief. So to start off with ones, when you're grieving, let yourself be messy. There's no guide for grief. There's no perfect way to grieve. You're going to be more emotional than you're comfortable with, and you can let yourself be a mess. If you have a one in your life that is grieving, a tip is to encourage their mess, allow them to be messy, and encourage that in their feelings without control. Twos, when you're grieving, ask for support and let yourself be supported. It feels unnatural to be the one being held. People are going to you for support, and now you're the one that needs to be supported. The people who love you will show up, but they may need you to ask. If you have a two in your life that's grieving, something to ask yourself, is how would they show up for you if you were grieving? Sometimes that gives us a lot of insight on how to be there for a two. For threes, grief isn't what we do or to be solved. We can't win at it. You can't move through it faster. The feelings are going to come and you have to sit with them. You can't control grief. You can't accomplish grief. You have to sit with them and allow them to come as they go. A tip for if you have somebody in your life that's a three grieving, ask them about their feelings. Help them get in touch with their needs outside of the doing. For fours, when you're grieving, consider your relationship to suffering. You sometimes prove that you can suffer long term. You like to be seen in your pain and you identify with it. You sometimes suffer longer than you need to, and you want others to suffer because you're suffering, and it causes you to at times inflict that pain on others. Pay attention to this and honor your own pain without blaming. A tip for if you have a four in your life that's grieving is to mirror their emotions back. Honor their emotions. Show them you are present in them. 5, allow your feelings to flow. You don't have to control or conceal your feelings. People can support you, and you're better when they do. You don't have to contain your grief. If you can get into your body, you can get into your feelings. A tip for if you have a 5 in your life that's grieving, ask before giving. They're very stingy with their space, and they fear their space will be violated. So show up and show them that you're not there to take from them and you're detached from their response. Stay present without overreaching. Kind of like, I'm here, but I'm okay if you don't take that opportunity or take advantage of that. 6, it's important to understand that uncertainty doesn't mean it's bad. Grief is very uncertain and it's unpredictable, and that doesn't have to be bad. Scary grief doesn't have to be bad. Be in the present with the uncertainty, and that's okay. A tip for if you have a 6 in your life that's grieving is to check in with them often. They rely on that external security, and even if you set alarms, long-term alarms, once a month for a year, check in with them regularly. Show them that you are there and you have the security they need in their grief. 7s, when you're grieving, don't create an escape plan. Your method is to bring joy, and you can feel feelings without a plan to escape them. You don't have to reframe them to the positive. A tip for if you have a 7 in your life that's grieving, something to keep in mind is that just because a 7 can show you the sunshine, don't assume they are okay in their grief. Be available, but similar to 5s, be detached, because 7s like their space and they don't want to feel violated. 8s, you have to prioritize self-kindness and softness to yourself. When you're grieving, it's not the time to power through. You don't have to be stronger. Let yourself be soft and know that that's a strength, not a weakness. Allow yourself to be loved in what feels weak. A tip, if you have an 8 in your life, is to show up in your strength. They are strong and they can break down, but if they sense that you're showing up with a need for strength, they'll automatically assume that responsibility because that's who they are. They have this strength. And for them to break down and be open and vulnerable with those feelings, they need to know that you're not in need and that they're safe. 9s, don't numb your feelings and be selfish. This isn't a time to create space for everyone else. You have to create the space for yourself. You can be there for yourself. A tip for nines, if you love a nine and they're grieving, is to ask them directly about themselves and their process. And as they're sharing with you, when they finish a sentence, wait a little extra longer to respond. Um, you want to create the space that communicates. You're waiting for them to talk like they always do for you and others. Give them a luxurious amount of time to be heard. One thing I want to add about Enneagram and the grief is that this is one of the most revealing things the Enneagram has taught me, as being an 8 and this really strong armor I have around a very tender heart. And as an 8 who is feeling repressed, we tend to deal with feelings that are uncomfortable or we don't know what to do with them by, how do we fix it? What do we need to do? I'm feeling sad. Well, what do I need to do about it? I can stay busy and that fixes my sadness. And I'm so thankful for the Enneagram because it showed me that that's the least productive way in dealing with your feelings. And in the midst of so much grief, I've been able to step inside the strength of vulnerability and be vulnerable with myself and others and practice that with others and express and feel the grief that I feel. And that has been definitely not the easier route, short term at least, because obviously that leads to major problems in the long run. But it's been a gift, and it's opened my world tremendously. The next part, I just want to kind of talk about the Enneagram as a spiritual tool. Originally, the Enneagram was created as a spiritual tool and personality tool. If that's not your thing, like if spirituality is not your thing, then you don't have to take that with it. But it is a huge part of it, and it's so powerful. So I just feel it's important to go over that. So when we think about the gospel and we break it down to just this one concept of you are loved, and that who you are loved and lovable. And there's so many other parts of the gospel that's tremendous and powerful, but that is it right there, of that you're loved. As you've probably noticed in the Enneagram, you see a lot of God. God is in all numbers. A way to think of it is how all 9 types make up the body of Christ, and the Enneagram is the face of God. And how when we all are in our healthy space and integrated with each other, we do so many powerful things and able to accomplish so many things that are life-changing for ourselves, but our relationships, and gives us a way to truly love ourselves, love others, and love God. Another thing that I like to think about is, where in the Bible does it say that God loved Jesus because he was perfect? We know that Jesus, who he was and the power he has within him, but we sometimes create this idea that our goal is to be perfect like Jesus. And I personally think it's so much deeper than that, because God spent more time in the Bible talking about how much he delighted in Jesus just for who Jesus was. And so why would we be held to a different standard? God delights in who we are, and the Enneagram gives us this amazing opportunity to truly be who we are in our brokenness, in our wholeness, and have abundant life. The Enneagram allows us to access true compassion. And what that means is that my aloneness and my insecurity can see your aloneness and insecurity and can sympathize and empathize with that. And having true compassion for ourselves and others is so profound and revealing. But we can't have compassion without self-knowledge. And that is so vital in spiritual life, of compassion. And sometimes we think, well, oh yeah, I'm compassionate, but We confuse it with things like pity. And so the Enneagram allows us to access that true compassion. So as I kind of mentioned, the Enneagram is traced back to the Christian monk, and he that's where the 7 deadly sins come from. And there are the deadly sins within each number, which I don't have for this presentation, but there's also holy motivations. And so it's cool to see spiritually how each number shows up spiritually and brings something amazing to the table. And so, 1, they bring order and goodness. 2, they bring connection and love. 3s bring value and worth. 4s bring authenticity and individuality. 5s bring clarity and autonomy. 6 brings awareness and loyalty. 7s bring freedom and joy. 8s bring strength and presence. 9s bring harmony and wholeness. In my personal Enneagram journey, I have never experienced God so deeply than I have through this journey. That's why I'm so passionate about it, because I have been able to experience his love in a way that I just didn't even know was in the realm of possibilities. Going back to that quote I mentioned earlier of the blind only see what they've touched. And there's so many parts of ourself and God and others that we don't even seek because we just assume it's not there. And the Enneagram just shows us so much in such a quick amount of time. I really love this quote by Thomas Merton. The beginning of love is the will to let those we love be perfectly themselves, the resolution not to twist them, to fit it our own image. If in loving them we do not love what they are, but only their potential likeness to ourselves, then we do not love them. We only love the reflection of ourselves we find in them. So, of course, and presenting the Enneagram to a group of counselors, I couldn't help but add this part because it's just so important, and I just get so much from the Enneagram in so many different ways. And I think, that's why I felt caught in the details, because there's just so much I want to share about the Enneagram, and it's just not feasible to try to share everything. But I do want to briefly talk about the Enneagram in counseling. So there are a lot of therapists that use the Enneagram directly in their counseling modality. And I would love to do that, but I'm not quite there yet. And so what's really helpful, especially outside of the counseling room, just in general, is not typing clients, because again, it's looking at motivation, and we're not in their heads. All we see is behavior. And so it's very easy to be wrong. But if we can understand their stance and orientation to time, it's gold. It's so rich, especially when their stance and orientation to time is different than ours. And so, for example, being able to get an idea of where a client is in their stance, if they are doing dominant, thinking dominant, feeling dominant, and where they're repressed, how it's different than ours, and where they're orientated in time, because it allows us to understand what they need and how to communicate with them. And it's so powerful. It just unlocks so much insight and wisdom into the other person. And I don't know how we operate without the Enneagram. I don't know how I lived without it when I got into it last year. And so it just allows us to peer into the client's window that they're looking out of, but also keeping the curtains, if you will, in our own window in check. In other words, by recognizing our window in which we look at the world as well as the clients, we're able to meet them where they are at and empathize so much deeper. And we're also able to mitigate those differences. And so for me, as a feeling repressed and having somebody in the counseling room who's feeling dominant, it no longer prevents me from empathizing. I'm able to still sit with them in those feelings, and I can even though I'm future oriented, I can sit with the client who's oriented to the past, because I can understand with the Enneagram that they need time to process this. And I don't, because I'm looking forward and I move quickly and I have a fast pace, and that's okay. That's okay that you're oriented to the past and present and future, and understanding where our heads are at and other people's head, and just knowing that it's okay that our heads aren't in the same place. I think it just offers so many opportunities in the counseling room. And also, again, just understanding their stance and orientation to time offers so many ways of interventions of just communicating and challenging and thinking differently with that client. Also, I the Enneagram I love because it separates the human condition from pathology. And what I mean by that is that the more that we can understand how the personality presents itself in different types of space, we can understand more of, okay, that is human condition manifesting in your personality, not pathology. And so, for example, sevens, these enthusiasts, they are very often misdiagnosed with ADHD. And I just think the Enneagram is a great tool to kind of mitigate those lines. And sixes, I mean, you can go ahead and assume how many people would diagnose a six with generalized anxiety disorder. But when we can first meet them where they're at in their human condition and separate that from pathology, I just think it's what we deserve and what our clients deserve. And it's honestly so much more powerful. So lastly, I'm going to give a brief overview on how to start your Enneagram journey and finding your type. So when finding your type, it's a journey. Online assessments, they're out there and there are some good ones, but keep in mind that you don't answer it based off behavior, because the Enneagram looks at motivation. And so if you don't have good self-awareness and good differentiation between those, then you're often going to be mistyped. And it's very, very, very common to be mistyped on an online assessment for the Enneagram. So the online assessments are more of a tool. And so you can do it and maybe look at the top 3 that it told you and explore those first. It might give you like a starting point, but definitely don't base your decision off of the first thing you take and the first number it gives you. Finding your number is a journey. You're not given your number. You're not told your number. It's a journey to find your number. And sometimes that can take people a long time. And I'm talking like years. And me as an 8, it took me a little while, like a couple months. And as an 8 who is future oriented and fast paced, that was extremely hard for me. And looking back, I should have just known that I was an 8 at that point. But anyways, so, it's a journey, and you can give yourself permission to not have to know your number right now and just explore it. A good way to approach it is to build a foundation understanding each of the types. I highly, highly, highly recommend this book that I put here on the left, The Road Back to You by Ian and Suzanne. Suzanne Stable is one of my favorite people in the Enneagram world. She is referred to as the Enneagram godmother. Anyways, and actually Ian, sorry, I can't say his name, Ian, he is a therapist, so that is a really interesting perspective as well. But that book does a really great job of breaking down the Enneagram into something so simple and easily understood, yet not losing the depth of its wisdom. So it's, as I said, it's important to kind of start off just understanding how the Enneagram works conceptually, and understanding just each of the 9 types. And then once you find your number, you can jump into wings and subtypes and other things like that. But really, it's just kind of get a solid foundation of what it is before doing that. When you're exploring your number, you're going to probably identify with a lot of different numbers, and that's totally fine and normal and expected. And the reason why is because you haven't understood completely what motivates you at your core. And so just give it some time and tune in your self-awareness, and eventually it will show itself to you as you pay more attention to your day-to-day and your behaviors, etc. And so some tips to when you are exploring your number is, on the levels of development, look in the unhealthy part, because we often spend a lot of time there, and sometimes that can kind of show us where we fall. Another way is thinking about stances of feeling, doing, and thinking dominant. Sometimes that might direct you into the triad to start with first. Also, I put in here as resources of the Enneagram podcast with Suzanne Stable. That's the second screenshot I put here, and those are the Spotify codes, so you can literally just scan those with your phone off this slide, or you can just search it in Spotify. But Suzanne Stable, again, is one of my favorite people. When I was exploring my number and trying to figure out where I was, I read this book, which I've read it like 5 times now. And also I've probably listened to every single one of Suzanne's podcasts, and just listening to other numbers talk, because there are basic core, desires and feelings and motivations, but it can look very different. And so being able to hear another person talk in each of the 9 types is really, really beneficial, and you can get that from her podcast. The other thing I put in here was the website link to the Enneagram Institute. That link is super, super helpful. I love that website. They go into depth about each type. They also go into mistypes. So like if you're torn between a 7 and a 1 and you're just can't really figure out which one of those you are, you can go to that website and look at mistypes, and it'll tell you what differentiates those numbers. It also will talk about compatibility in terms of what relationships look like, not because they're not compatible. And so if you and your husband, partner, whatever, are 4 and an 8, for example, you can go onto that website and look at what a relationship with a 4 and 8 looks like, and what should they be cautious about. I also put in the Spotify links to the Enneagram album. It's a song for each Enneagram, and I love listening to them. It's done by Sleeping at Last, and again, that's the code you can just scan with your phone. And each number has a song, and down every word, every beat, everything about the song for each number is intentional. And if you are curious, the next screenshot I put there on the farthest right is the link to his podcast, and the podcast goes into depth of how he created the songs to mirror that number. And I love them. I think they're powerful, and I love listening to my number, the song of the 8. It helps ground me at times and remember kind of why I do what I do and where I came from. And I also love listening to the other ones and reminding me how the other numbers interact in the world. So those are some good starting places. The book is probably one of the best places to start, and then follow it up with exploring different interviews on the podcast. And that website, the Enneagram Institute, is amazing. A lot of this, I shouldn't even say a lot of this, all of this information has pretty much come from that book and Suzanne's podcast, because I reread that book all the time, and I listen to her podcast probably every day. And so that's where a good starting place is. But, just do your research and give it time, and, approach your brokenness with a non-judgmental stance, and understanding that, there's enough space for that, and there's enough grace for that. And the Enneagram isn't just going to unmask you and leave you. It's going to pick you up and give you a way to grow into the most abundant, full life. And so that's kind of an overview of the Enneagram. Feel free to ask any questions or whatever, if I can help in any way. But I appreciate you guys letting me do this and listening. I I know it's a lot to sit through all of this information dumping, but I love the Enneagram. It has changed my life, and I love sharing it. And I'm so thankful for it because I know that, I got into the Enneagram about a year ago, not knowing all the things that were going to be in store for me in my life this year. And I know that it was ordained by God and the timing, and able to get to know myself so I can truly love myself and truly love others and love God. And it's just been an amazing experience. And I hope that you're able as well to, you know, find healing in the Enneagram as well. So, yeah, that's it. Again, let me know if I can help in any way.